I was asked to speak about how this war is changing the identity of Ukrainian churches. Now, I understand that you come from different backgrounds and you had already a series of lectures connected, I think, to the Orthodox, to the Protestant. So if there are things or references in my lecture that you don't get, don't understand, or need more background, yes, you can raise your hand or interrupt me and I will explain to you that, okay? I just am afraid that I can go too deep into details and I will lose you or some of you. So please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Now, a very brief introduction, although I think this is something that you know already. Ukraine is a majority Orthodox country with some Catholic and Protestant presence. Since Ukrainian independence in 1990s and until very recently, until 2019, there have been 3 major Orthodox churches in Ukraine. One was so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which had a self-governing status within the Russian Orthodox Church, at least till the last May. And there were 2 unrecognized by the world Orthodoxy churches. One was called Kyiv Patriarchate, and another was called Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. Autocephalous means independent. It's a Greek word, means that you are ahead of your own. Yeah? Autos and kephali or kephale. Yes, kephali means the head, autos means the self. So you run yourself. So this church was called itself Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, but it wasn't recognized as Autocephalous Church. But it's an important term. Autocephalous means fully independent in the Orthodox canonical tradition. And Orthodox Church is composed of 14, 15, 16 autocephalous churches. It depends how you call it. It's sort of a federation of churches. Now, so before 2019, Ukraine didn't have its own independent Orthodox Church. It had 2 unrecognized and 1 which was part of Moscow Patriarchate. Now, in 2018, 2019, the 2 unrecognized churches or schismatic churches have joined with additions of some bishops from the Moscow Patriarchate, and they formed a church that subsequently was recognized by the Patriarchate of Constantinople in Turkey, the oldest Orthodox Church, as autocephalous, as independent. Since then, I think around 1,000 parishes have passed from the Church of Moscow Patriarchate to this new church. So this is a little bit the background on the Orthodox churches. Besides the Orthodox, Ukraine has 2 Catholic churches, which are in unity, canonical Eucharistic unity. It's the Greek Catholic Church. It's an Eastern Rite Catholic Church. It existed until 16th century as Orthodox Church, and then it united with Rome by keeping and conserving all its canonical liturgical structure. There is no celibacy for the priests. There is a different calendar, etc. But there is also a Roman Catholic, Latin Rite, yes, Catholic Church in Ukraine, as in Slovakia or in Kenya, which originally was composed of people from Polish, German, Hungarian descent. So all Roman Catholics were foreigners, but now the situation has changed. There are more and more people who speak Ukrainian or even Russian within this church, although I think most bishops are of Polish origin, if not all of them. The Protestants, Protestantism has a long history in Ukraine. However, today, most of the Protestant communities are evangelical, yes, in American or English sense of the word, Pentecostal or Baptist. There are very few Calvinists, mainly close to Hungary, and there are very few Lutherans. They are all over the country. So it's already a complex and pluralistic situation, as you can see. The question which I am trying to address in this lecture is how the war affects those churches and how the war forces them to change. What changes does this war imposes onto them? Now, the war didn't start yesterday. Yes, this tension with Russia, with a very strong military phase in the east, in Donbas region, has been ongoing since 2014. So some of the questions regarding to this conflict in the east of Ukraine have already affected the churches, and probably the independence, the autocephaly of the Ukrainian, of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in 2019 was a product of this war in Donbas. However, the full-scale invasion had even deeper consequences on the churches. And I think some of the effects are yet unknown, and we can only speculate about that. We will see in a couple of years. Now, the war has changed the country. The war has changed the military, the diplomacy, the medical services, the charities. The war has changed universities. But it also has changed the churches. You can follow different reports on how because of the war, Ukrainian churches, church buildings, seminaries have been destroyed or sacked. I think by now there are more than 200 churches that have been destroyed or damaged. There have been priests who have been killed, theological seminaries sacked, etc. So everybody became a victim, and the church was also a victim of this war. The war, as every war, makes you hate. And I think a temptation to every Ukrainian and also to every believer is to hate. The war makes you engaged in the propaganda competition. I think René Girard, like Franco-American philosopher and theologian, when he's reflecting on Clausewitz, says that a war is like a tango dance. We don't have Argentinians here, no? What he meant by that your partner in the war decides some of the style that you are going to follow. Yeah. Your enemy imposes onto you some actions that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And I think hatred, propaganda is something that is imposed in a way onto Ukraine by this war. And I think it's not an easy situation for different churches in Ukraine to witness to truth, to ask their own believers not to hate, because the climate of the war is such which is conducive to hatred. Now, when we contemplate the tragedy of the war, when we see the pictures of massacres, yes, from Bucha, Irpin, other places, and when we also remember that this war is supported by 70% of Russian population or even more, when we see that this war is being justified by the Russian Orthodox Church, I think the natural temptation is to hate Russians, the Russian Church. But that's not what the Christians are supposed to be doing. And I think it's very important that, for example, the major Archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic bishops, the Protestants and other Orthodox said, you shall not hate. Yes, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, the head of Ukrainian Greek Catholics, said that when we hate, we have been already defeated by our enemy. So I think the biggest challenge and the test for the churches, whether they can or not remain churches, is whether they can avoid this narrative of hatred, calls for hatred. Another major challenge was the humanitarian aid. Yeah, with millions of refugees, internally displaced people, churches were forced to help them, find resources, call their international partners for help, and take care of the refugees. So I think this was a general context in which all the churches have been introduced into. Now let me look individually. I will jump from one church to another and say how the war is making those changes, those churches to change on, and what challenges are they facing. I will start with the Orthodox. So today there are two major Orthodox jurisdictions. One is the church that has been traditionally for centuries in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate. They are called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, if your spiritual center is in Moscow and your patriarch is justifying this war that leads you to have millions of your faithful displaced, thousands killed, dozens of churches sacked, several priests kept and captured, you don't feel any more comfortable to belong to such a church. You will lose credibility. So I think this church was under the biggest pressure to change. For several centuries, Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been part of the Patriarchate of Moscow. It meant that its bishops have attended in the synods, in the church councils in Moscow. Its future priests were trained in Russia, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There was a lot of spiritual exchange among the monasteries. Ukrainians would go to the pilgrimages to different Russian holy places, and the Russians would come to Ukraine. So there was a lot of exchange. As I don't know, as probably the Slovak or Ukrainian Catholics would go to Poland, to Częstochowa on a pilgrimage, as I don't know, Chileans or Peruvians would go to yes, to some holy places in Brazil or in Mexico. I don't know how it works in Africa. There is this, yes, spiritual cooperation. The moment the war has started and the Patriarch Kirill has, in a way, endorsed this war, the very moment this happened, the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church decides to publicly condemn the war, and he calls this the repetition of the sin of Cain against his brother Abel. And I think there are two ways to interpret this. On one hand, yes, the killing, the murder of Abel is the first murder in biblical history. So it's in a way a paradigmatical theological example of murder. So it's clear that by invading Ukraine, by killing Ukrainians, Russians are repeating this biblical sin of killing. But there is another part of this analogy. Cain and Abel are brothers. So it's not just a murder, it's a fratricide. It's a betrayal. And I think that what Metropolitan Onufri meant by this reference to the sin of Cain against his brother Abel was very much felt as a betrayal from a brother. Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church lived as brothers. Yeah. So they felt that this was a betrayal, a brother killing its own brother. Until 2022, notwithstanding the war in Donbass, notwithstanding the political tensions between Russia and Ukraine, this Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, tried to keep its relation with Moscow. They were in difficult position. Ukrainian civil society was pressuring them, challenging them. How can you still remain dependent from Moscow? The parishes have been leaving this church, and yet they decided to be part of the Russian Orthodox Church. They were answering to the Ukrainians and to other churches that they want to keep neutrality, that they didn't want to choose between a Ukrainian identity and to cut their own deep-rooted ties with the Russian Church. They said that they don't want to fully embrace Ukrainian nation-building project, that they are a church of Ukrainians, for Ukrainians, that they can be Ukrainian church, although they depend from Russia. Until 2022, this church has refused to acknowledge that what was going on in the east of Ukraine was a Russian invasion. They called it a civil war, or used some other euphemisms. But the war, February 22, has changed everything. Although until now, they keep saying that they were an independent part of Russian Orthodox Church, what became evident is that they were part of this ideology of the Russian world. There have been a lot of publications. I suppose that many other people who spoke before me approached this issue. Maybe Father Roman can nod if it's correct or not. What remains, I would only focus on one aspect of this Russian world ideology. The Russian Orthodox Church, since 2009 and 10, came out with this concept of Russian world, which was sort of updated version of the idea of Holy Russia. Yes, the unity between Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians. And when they came out with this idea in 2009, 2010 of Russian world, they said that actually Russian world is a cosmopolitan concept. Now, in Russian language and in Ukrainian language, you have Russian has two terms. Just to limit myself to the Russian language, you have two terms, Русский and Российский. You have Rus and you have Россия. What is the difference? Unfortunately, in English or in French, I don't know about other Slavic languages, you don't have this distinction. Now, the Русский is more a reference to history, to ethnicity. Российский is more a political reference. For example, you speak about Russian language, you use Русский. You speak about Russian church, you say Русский. When you speak about the Russian state, you say Российский. Yeah? Russian Federation, you say Российская Федерация. Now, when the Russian Orthodox Church came with this concept of Русский мир, they claimed that it's not a political, that it's not a reference to the Russian Federation. It's a reference to the shared historical tradition of ancient Kievan medieval state. It's like a common spiritual unity between Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So they said that Русский here doesn't mean Российский, that it's not linked to the interest, to political interests of one state, that this concept and the church, Russian church, is not a political instrument of the Russian Federation. And he even said, the Patriarch Kirill in 2009, 2010, that the fact that Ukraine or Belarusia have their own now sovereignty, this is something good. This will help the church to respect those local traditions. Now, with the time, it has been discovered that this allegedly cosmopolitan, yes, non-linked to nation state narrative was a soft power instrument in the hands of Kremlin, yeah, and Russian Federation. And that Russian Orthodox Church has been cooperating with Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russian military, in a degree in which they were not cooperating with Ukraine, Belarusia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, any other country where they have their own jurisdiction. So the first problem here is, like, as a philosophical idea, this Russian world stopped being spiritual and became political. And the second is that it's like constructed on a lie and inconsistency. It declares itself to be cosmopolitan, supranational, but in fact, it identifies itself with one modern nation, Russian Federation. Let me give you a couple of examples on how the politics of Russian Federation and this narrative of the Russian world coincide. Russian Federation, Putin speak about the West, of NATO, as being threats to Russia, as being enemies to Russia. They want to destroy, annihilate Russia, they are a threat. The Russian Orthodox Church makes the same narrative at the level of theology or pastoral and spiritual discourse. They say, oh, the West is decadent. The West promotes LGBT issues. Patriarch Kirill, in one of his homilies after the start of the war, said that the people of Donbass is fighting because Europe wants to impose gay parades on the streets of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, it might be partially true, but at the same time, the Catholic Church in the West tends to be skeptical about LGBT and gender narratives. So the Catholic position is not very different from the Orthodox on LGBT issues. However, the Russian Orthodox Church says all the West is like this. They fail to see that many majority Orthodox countries are part of NATO. Take Greece or Bulgaria. They are Orthodox majority countries. They are part of NATO. So on the issue of the West or anti-Westernism, political position of the state and theological position of the church goes hand in hand. The second example. Now, today we live in the world of so-called nation states. Yes, the UN Charter says that the nations have rights to self-determination. Universities don't have right to self-determination. Churches don't have right to self-determination. I don't know, football clubs don't have right to self-determination. I don't know, philatalistic circles, you know, or tango dancing clubs don't have this right, but the nations have. So in order to have your state, you need to be a nation. Now, Mr. Putin says that Ukrainians are not a nation. They are artificial nation invented by Lenin. They don't have right to their own nation. Therefore, they don't have right to their own sovereign state. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church makes the same narrative, but theologically. They say that Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, they are all one Russian people, Ruski narod. They are one people, one nation. Yeah? So this contributes to the political narrative that Ukrainians are not a nation and therefore should not have a nation state. Now, why is this relevant while we are talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because although they didn't deny the Ukrainian right to self-determination, but they participated in these narratives about the spiritual unity between Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians. They engaged in this anti-Westernism. So in a way, they were engaged in a theopolitical or theological political project, which gave them the ground to invasion. There have been some instances of discrimination of this jurisdiction in Ukraine. Ukrainian state tried to force this church to put the reference to the fact that they are part of Russian Orthodox Church in their official title. So when Ukrainians would enter the church building, they would see that this church belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church. They rebelled against that. However, these instances of discrimination were not a persecution, while this church has complained that they are being persecuted by the Ukrainian state. Now, and Putin, in his famous speech shortly before the invasion, said that Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine needs to be defended. So, since Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been complicit in this Russian war, has been so close to Russia, when the war has started, they felt betrayed. No, they felt as Abel betrayed by his brother Cain. What do they decide to do? They decide to cut their links with Russia. On May 27, 2022, they gather a council in Kyiv to proclaim their independence. So they express their disagreement with Patriarch Kirill. They say, we disagree with the position of Kirill on the war in Ukraine. We decide to change our statute and to get rid of any reference to the fact that our capital is in Moscow. And we would like to be independent. We would like to have some dialogue with other Orthodox. We would like to have to open our own parishes abroad. Now, I started my lecture by reflecting about this term, autocephaly. An independent Orthodox Church calls itself autocephalous church. Now, the trick with this council and this proclamation of independence is that they didn't use this term. They didn't proclaim themselves autocephalous. So the question is whether they are independent in an Orthodox canonical way or not. This might seem to you as an issue of little importance. However, since every other Orthodox Church which is independent calls itself autocephalous, proclaiming independence and not using this traditional canonical language makes you question whether you are proclaiming autocephaly or not. So is this church independent or not? On the one hand, they said we are making the changes to our statutes, we are getting rid of the reference to the Russian Orthodox Church. For example, if the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would die or resign, they would choose a new one, and this choice of the candidate should be confirmed by the Russian Orthodox Church. This is one of the points that they are getting rid in their statutes. One of the relative points of independence is to bless the holy mirror, yes, the liquid that is used for chrismation. This is unlike in the Roman Catholic Church, where every bishop has his own chrisma. In the Orthodox tradition, it's usually the chief of the church, so of autocephalous church. So they decide we will do our own. We will have our own blessing of this liquid. So it seems that it's an autocephalous church. On the other hand, they don't use the term autocephaly. There is no clear condemnation from the Russian Orthodox Church of this. You would say, I don't know, if Sicily proclaims its independence of Italy, Italian government would condemn this act. Russian Orthodox Church doesn't condemn this independence. Usually an independence gets recognized. Yes, if you as Sicily want to become an independent state, you want other states to recognize you. You will seek a place in, I don't know, UN, in the United Nations. Ukrainian Orthodox Church doesn't do this. They don't ask other autocephalous churches to recognize them, to receive them into this federation of autocephalous churches. So it's unclear. One of the possible interpretation is that they have decided to be independent autocephalous church. Another possible interpretation is that they just use the language of independence to speak about their own autonomy, which they had already within the Moscow Patriarchate. The other possible solution that they don't know yet what they are looking for, and they decide to use ambiguous language to be able to switch in any time, depending on how their own believers react to this, depending on how the war goes. Yes, if Ukraine is being invaded by Russia, they can say, oh, we never proclaim independence. If Russia retrieves, they say, oh, yes, we proclaim independence. So we have three possible interpretations, and frankly speaking, I don't know which one is more plausible. Okay. So to conclude on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the war has changed the identity of this church by forcing them to cut their links with Russia, to proclaim independence, but it remains unclear what sort of independence it is. And I think in following years, it will be clear whether it's an autocephaly or not. Let me now go to look at the Ukraine, another Orthodox jurisdiction, Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This jurisdiction has been created in 2018-19 with the support of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which is the most important among the 14 or 15 or 16 autocephalous churches within Orthodox Commonwealth. Now, they look at the situation, at the current situation in Ukraine, and this crisis and problems within the other Orthodox jurisdiction as a chance to create the unity within the Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine. So they make more or less the following calculation. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which belonged to, or has belonged to Moscow Patriarchate, has become so unpopular, so that the parishes from this church will switch jurisdiction and move to our church. It's the same liturgy. Both churches have similar foreign recognition by other autocephalous Orthodox churches. You don't notice much difference. The icons look the same. People sometimes don't care. Some sociological polls say that 20% of Ukrainian Orthodox don't identify themselves with one church or another. they believe that they are Orthodox, and it doesn't matter to which jurisdiction they would go for their services. So I believe that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is considering this war as a chance to achieve the unity. If they manage to have a huge number of parishes coming from the Orthodox Church, from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to join them, they will then become the biggest, their Orthodox Church of Ukraine, if you want, their de facto state church of Ukraine. So far, so since the creation of this church in 2018-19, I think more than 1,000 of parishes from the Moscow Patriarchate Church switched to the new church, which accounts to around 10% or maybe less of the number of parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate Church. So they have 11,000 parishes, they lost 1,000, which is a lot, but it's not critical. Yeah. We will see whether the Orthodox Church of Ukraine manages to unite, to have more parishes entering this jurisdiction. The war, and I will return to this a little bit later, opened some doors for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Ecumenically, many Catholic, Protestant leaders have traditionally cooperated with the Russian Orthodox Church. And they were in touch with Ukrainian Orthodox through Moscow. Now, just I think a week ago, the head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was received and met with Justin Welby, yes, the primate of the Church of England and Anglican Communion. Without the war, probably this wouldn't be possible. There will be a General Assembly of the World Council of Churches, which is the biggest ecumenical organization. They will have their annual, not annual, like I don't think they every 4 or 5 years or every 10 years they do a big union assembly. This time it will be in Germany, in Karlsruhe. The Ukrainian schismatic so-called jurisdictions have been never invited to attend. Now they invited representatives from this church. So the war will allow them, and the war and the solidarity with the Ukrainians and with Ukrainian Orthodox will have the effect that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine will come out eventually from this isolation where they have traditionally been. I don't think that it would have happened so quickly without the war. If this unity of the Orthodox will be achieved, there is a risk, I think, felt by Catholics and Protestants, that this one big Orthodox Church of Ukraine will become a de facto state church. They will have more privileges than Ukrainian Catholics or Protestants. In terms of influence in public matters, access to schools, hospitals, military, financial resources, etc. So we'll see what happens. But that's also a possibility, and I think Catholics and Protestants are frightened a little bit by that. Now, let's see what are the challenges and changes in the identity that this war is causing Catholics in Ukraine. So there are two Catholic churches, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, around 10% of Ukrainian population, and around 2% of Ukrainian population, which are Latin Rite Catholics. A couple of weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Vitaly Krivitsky, when was asked by a journalist from an Italian newspaper, Avvenire, regarding the possibility of Pope Francis's visit to Ukraine, declared, I quote, "A part of the population didn't welcome some of the Pope's words concerning the war in Ukraine, which were considered wrong. It is thus necessary to reconstruct a consensus around his journey. The Holy See can play a fundamental role as mediator between us and Russia. Negotiations need conciliators, and the Pope is such a person, although someone here no longer considers the Pope as being super partes." End quote. Now, this answer coming from a Latin Rite Ukrainian bishop reveals the difficulty which Catholic hierarchy in the country has in making the Holy See's stance on Ukraine acceptable to their church members and wider society. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has a long trace of criticism of the Pope and the Holy See as early as 1970s. Ukrainian Greek Catholics have ordained bishops without consent of the Holy See, have criticized the fact that Eastern Catholics are somehow too much controlled by the Vatican, that they have requested to be elevated to the rank of the Patriarchate, which has been denied by the Vatican, and they have been very critical about this. But Latin Rite bishops and pastors have been very much obedient to what the Holy See does and says. So, to have the Bishop of Kyiv saying to the Pope, "No, don't come, because people in Ukraine are not ready to receive you," they consider some of your statements to be too ambiguous or not neutral, is a big change that Ukraine has never seen. There were, I think, a few instances of criticism by the bishops in the past on some expressions by Pope Francis on the LGBT issues. I think when the Pope said about a gay priest, "Oh, it's I don't know, who am I to judge?" Then there was some criticism, but nothing of that sort. I believe that Tolik Babinsky, yes, Anatoly, the person who will speak after me, will focus on the position of the Holy See in this war. So I don't want to, as a way, eat his bread here. But I just want you to be aware that the Catholics in Ukraine have a difficulty in digesting this neutrality of the Holy See toward the war in Ukraine. Now, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis claims that peace is impossible without truth, justice, or memory, which suggests that unconditional peace is not an option. Pope Francis says that we need stark and clear truth, Fratelli Tutti 226. He argues that we no longer have use for empty diplomacy, dissimulation, double speak, hidden agendas and good manners that mask the reality. Cardinal Czerny, and who comments on Fratelli Tutti, he argues that to elucidate the genesis of the conflict, it has to explain the causes and to narrate what really happened is both a duty of justice and a right of the victims, end quote. Now, to many Ukrainian Catholics, it seems that these lines have not yet been fully put in practice by the Holy See. Why is this important? First of all, it's important because this situation forces Ukrainian hierarchs, Ukrainian Catholic bishops, on the one hand, to somehow camouflage the neutrality of the Holy See. So they are forced sometimes to criticize, for example, with the Via Crucis, when there was a Russian and Ukrainian women who carried the cross. I think Ukrainian bishops criticized the Pope's decision. On the other hand, they need to underline anything the Pope says, every prayer, every couple of words on Ukraine the Pope says, as proves that the Pope is with Ukraine. The question that I'm asking myself, will this neutrality of the Holy See lead Ukrainian Catholics to leave their congregations? If you look, I don't know, in 20th century at France, Czech Republic, it seems that some nations have opted to disassociate themselves from the Catholic Church, yes, and have in a way decatholicized or desecularized their identity for the very reason that the Catholic Church was so international, reliant on, I don't know, supranational religious orders, and depended and made the Catholic Church depend from a foreign center, escaping national control. We will see whether this neutrality of the Holy See, this so-called Ostpolitik, yes, the interest of the Vatican and Pope in having and keeping Russia as a dialogue partner on ecumenical issues, on geopolitical issues, whether this will lead to secularization of Ukrainian Catholics and the desire to maybe switch to the Orthodox jurisdiction. Finally, how much time do I still have, Roman? Minus 10, nothing. Okay, finally, I just say a couple of words on the Protestants and we'll end here. Now, as I said, the Protestants in Ukraine were often, the majority of the Protestants belong to the evangelical or Baptist or Pentecostal tradition. Many have had traditionally pacifist positions. There was a huge Mennonite influence in different regions of Ukraine. Ukrainian Protestants, evangelicals, and Pentecostals and Baptists have traditionally had very strong ties with Russia. Most of their communities are in Eastern Ukraine, and they all belong to all sort of Eurasian associations, often run from Moscow. They used Russian as a language for their pastoral activity. So the war led them to challenge, to question both of those principles, their pacifism and their relations with Russia. When the war has started, the Lutherans, yes, who have a tradition of engagement with the state, the Catholic, the Lutheran, Ukrainian Lutheran bishop of Ukraine, who is in Kharkiv, Pavlo Smytsnyuk, said that what we need is a just peace, which will result in expulsion of the aggressor from all occupied territories and fair punishment for the crimes committed, end quote. So he said that all those who can join the armed forces should do so and defend their country. However, the Union of Evangelical Baptist churches, in their faith statements, which is probably the biggest Protestant denomination in Ukraine, took a very pacifist stance. The pastor Antoniuk asked communities to pray, and he said that prayer is our weapon. So they were building on this pacifist tradition. However, seeing their communities destroyed, they are changing it. For them, it becomes more legitimate to gather money, to help the army, to serve in the army. The same with the Russian connections. They are cutting their ties with the bishops or pastors in Russia. They are writing angry letters asking the evangelical Baptist leaders in Russia to condemn this war. So, to conclude, this war has all sorts of challenges for Ukrainian churches, and I think it will completely transform the confessional identity, both within each church and among the churches. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry if I took too much time. Thank you.